I think we should be good. All right, cool, cool. Well, welcome back, fam. Thank you so much for pulling up. Today we are going to be diving straight into the world of React. So y'all can react to that. You know what I'm saying? Give me some love, give me some likes. You know what I'm saying? Get some confetti in the chat. You know what I'm saying? Spam the chat with as much positive stuff as you can. Because yeah, this is a big milestone for all of us. I think it's been a bunch of weeks. We've been talking a lot about different fundamental web dev topics, everything from, basic HTML to styling with CSS to, getting into using JavaScript with the document object model and all of the wonderful things JavaScript allows us to do. And so the next evolution of our workflow is going to be us using JavaScript even more in our workflow to make it even easier for us to basically programmatically create our websites, for lack of better words, right? And so instead of having to define everything all up front and say, hey, here's everything that this web page has to have, we can use JavaScript very intentionally to create the type of interfaces that we want our user to see in different settings based on different situations. I made this joke a couple of sessions ago when we were first talking about events and things, like the modern web is full of different events, clicks, drags, drops, everything, right? All of those events are opportunities for our web page to react to those changes, right? And so I think it's real cool. I don't particularly know why they named React, but I like to think about it from the standpoint of it really gives us such an amazing opportunity to react to so many changes in the web page, based on user behavior, based on changes in the data. So yeah, React makes a lot of things really easy. So the fact is that this is one of those core competencies for web dev that is becoming more and more the norm, right? There's a lot of different JavaScript-based web frameworks out there. You might have heard of some like Vue or Angular or some of these other ones. But React is still one of the top ones. And I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon because it's such a widely used library and framework that makes our lives easier. So with regards to y'all's career search and the work y'all are trying to put into learn enough about your computer science skills so that you can go get a job, this is definitely one of those things you're going to want to learn. And hopefully today we can learn it by doing it, right? I think sometimes it's harder to learn in these little steps. So let's just build something, talk through all of the stuff going on in the code. That way you can see it, see how it works, see how somebody would build it, and learn as you're building it with me. So if that's cool with you and you're ready to do that, just give me a thumbs up or some love in the chat and let's make it happen, fam. Again, pardon the lack of exuberant energy, you know what I'm saying? Your voice fasting, alhamdulillah. So energy is a little lower than it typically would be. But yeah, cool. We should be good to go. All right, bet. So let's talk a little bit about React, and then we'll get into what we're going to build and how we're going to build it together and the things we're going to need to have to build it. So first things first, React is oops, I'm on the wrong page of the docs. Excuse me, fam. React is a library for web and user interfaces. So what that means is like, let's break that down. A user interface. How many of y'all have heard of the word user interface before? So just give it thumbs up if you've heard of the words user interfaces in any capacity. Hopefully everybody in some capacity has heard of a user interface. Essentially, a user interface is just a layer in front of some code that a user interacts with in order for things to happen on the software side. So we create user interfaces in order to give a person, an actual person, an opportunity to interact with something that will then interact with our code, right? And so there's some apps that don't use user interfaces, and typically those applications don't have actual users using them, right? Maybe it's just a extension of a piece of code or a process that just gets called and it runs on its own, right? But no one ever needs to see it or interact with it. It just kind of runs. that is way different than like in the web capacity where, hey, people are going to be looking at your websites, people are going to be interacting with them. So you want to provide the best experiences for people as they are navigating your particular web application. So React makes it easy for us to create web, and it says native user interfaces as well. Because fun fact about React, if you knew this fun fact, give me a thumbs up. But fun fact about React, you can also use React to create mobile applications. So outside of just creating web-based applications like websites, you can also use React and some of the libraries built off of React in order to build mobile applications, so iPhone and Android-based applications as well. So that's what is also super exciting about learning React is that, hey, now you have something that you can use to also tap into some of the mobile cross-platform spaces as well. So React itself is a pretty popular library. There's a lot of different aspects to it that make it what it is. And so I'm just going to scroll through some of these to just kind of give you the gist. And then we're going to actually see these in action as we start building out some applications ourselves. So the main pieces of React that we have to understand are one, the React library and the React DOM library, which are two libraries that allow for us to essentially build these web application user interfaces. So React and React DOM are two libraries that we're going to interact with in order to essentially get access to particular JavaScript functions and built-in functions to these libraries that will allow for us to programmatically create our user interfaces on our web apps using JavaScript. The React library is responsible for a few things, but the React DOM library is responsible for a couple other things as well. But we use both of them in the capacity for building our applications out. Some of the things that we're going to talk about when it comes to React, right? And the things that we're going to end up learning over time. So we're going to talk a lot about creating and nesting components, right? Components are the essential building block of using React, right? Here you can see a quick little example of a function, a functional component. We use components in React to essentially create the different elements that would show up on our user interface. So whereas the whole user interface might include a image of some text and a button, right? One of those building blocks clearly is the button. And so we might want to create a component to represent that button. So you'll start seeing as we build out some more React applications that there's this component-based logic to how you build React applications, meaning that every application that you build in React is going to have this kind of programmatic component-based aspect to it as you are building it out. So creating nested components is going to be really important. Beyond that, we're going to learn a lot about a markup language and syntax called JSX. It is one of the more nuanced pieces of working with React that kind of can throw you for a loop if you're a new web developer, mostly because, especially if you're coming from a background like we've been talking about, where we're talking strictly HTML, strictly JavaScript, strictly CSS, no intertwining of the three outside of JavaScript, maybe manipulating some HTML here and there. JSX comes to kind of functionally distort our concept of how we structure our actual code to get our web pages together. Because JSX is essentially a JavaScript syntax that allows for us to refer to the types of elements that would eventually become HTML elements, but we can still reference them as JavaScript objects and use them in a way that is very intrinsic to regular JavaScript programming. And what I mean by that is in a JavaScript app, you would expect to be able to do things like create variables, call functions, right? Have conditional logic and things of that nature. And the reality is, like, to do all of that in an HTML document isn't possible really, because the JavaScript lives separate from the actual HTML. But with JSX, you can actually intertwine the element that you want to visually show with JavaScript data. And that becomes a very helpful aspect to allowing us to create these web pages that are a bit more dynamic and a lot more primed for dynamic programming using JavaScript. Um, we'll talk a bit about adding styles and just the ways that that works in a React application. Turns out it's pretty similar to how it works with relationship to HTML and CSS. The difference being that within React, instead of using like the class attribute, we use what's called class name, which is a slightly similar variation to the typical class attribute, but in the JavaScript context, we call it class name, so it knows that this is a React element as well. But the CSS is basically the same in terms of how you write your CSS for your styling. So we'll maybe take a look at doing some stylistic stuff. Displaying data, right? And like I was getting at, one of the big values of using React versus just regular HTML is the fact that you can call your visual elements. So let's say I have a heading that I want to show on my application, but with that heading, I want to pass some data, right? I can use JavaScript to pass data into HTML, or what would be HTML, right? We use JSX in order to make this possible. So in this return statement, we're passing a JSX heading element, but with some data that is coming from some JavaScript data that is probably set somewhere else. Which is super helpful, right? Because it just allows us to, like I said before, programmatically create our front end of our applications. We can also pass those JavaScript pieces of data into attributes, right? So in addition to having the data just be part of some HTML, we can pass data into any of the attributes that would go into a JSX element. And the JSX elements abide by many of the same attributes that you're used to for their HTML counterpart, right? So an image in HTML would have a source attribute. So for us, we would definitely have a source attribute that we'd have to set for an image in JSX. But yeah, it gets even more interesting when you like kind of look at it at full. So here's an example of like this is an example coming from the React Dev documentation. This is like this is the main documentation for React. So definitely a web resource to check out. They have a bunch of really good resources on learning how to use React, and we're just kind of walking through the Learn tab to just take a look at all of the different aspects of what goes on in React. But here's an example of like of actual full JavaScript file with some components and some logic in it, right? So how we read this is like so, right? Any JavaScript function that we create that we want to essentially represent a visual element on our application, we call a component, right? Components are essentially functions. It's the best way to think about it. Or they're objects of data in JavaScript. We typically, nowadays, there's a lot more, there are a couple of different ways to create components before, but nowadays the most common way is to create a function to define a component. So we end up creating what is just really just a regular function. But the difference is what that function is responsible for, and what any JavaScript React component is responsible for, is returning the data that will eventually be rendered onto the application. So in this case, this component is called profile. We can tell a component is a component or a function is a component by way of the capitalized letter of the name of the particular function. So typically we don't capitalize function calls or function names in JavaScript. So one thing that helps you know that something might be a component is the fact that just as a best practice, we typically keep components with a capitalized letter first. So this is a component called profile. Again, this is just a function, really. That's it. We'll talk about this export default thing in a second. This is just a function. And this function is returning something, right? Like some functions return strings, some functions return Booleans, some functions return arrays, right? This function's returning JSX. So remember, like I said, the JSX is still valid JavaScript. But it is, because of the fact that it's valid JavaScript, we can return it in functions, we can pass it as data, all of those great things. But what's unique about it is that this is also representing the visual element that we would want to show finally when we are rendering our code to our actual HTML file. And so in this particular component, they're returning a component that has a heading and an image. And what we can see here is the heading has some data passed into it of user.name. The image also has some data passed into it, user.image URL, the alt text, which is the text that shows up if the image failed to load. It's a string that's saying, hey, photo of user.name. So it's also using some of this user data logic. And then even here in the style, you can see that the style attribute, which is a way for us to create inline styles without connecting a CSS file, is also making use of a couple properties off of the user object. Now, looks like the user object was defined here as just a piece of data in this particular JavaScript file. But because this user data is defined, right, just like in any of the other applications you might have worked on with JavaScript, that being defined gives us the opportunity to leverage that data later on in the file and in the function. So these are the kinds of things that make React really exciting, is the fact that we can have an entire JavaScript file dedicated to what we want to show visually on our HTML. But the thing that makes it even doper than before is that we can write that entire file in JavaScript. We don't need to have an HTML file per se created to mirror all of these elements. What happens is React will put those elements into an HTML document for us. So we can't get away from HTML, and this is an important point for everybody. You're not going to get away from HTML when it comes to working with React, right? So if you thought, oh, like now that we're doing React, I don't ever have to learn any more HTML, that's actually not the case, right? All of the JSX elements that you're going to be using are still valid HTML elements. And so when you're confused about a particular element to use in your code for your front end, right, it's going to come back to what is the HTML element that does the thing you're trying to do. And then you can use that reference to that particular type of element to figure out what is the JSX equivalent, which is typically the same name as the HTML originating element. So we are going to embark on a journey of building out more React applications for ourselves. So I hope that y'all are excited, because this is getting into some new territory that we've been to before, but it's going to be super, super helpful. So today we're going to work on building out a pretty simple-ish React project that will at least show us some of the core things that we can do with React. It's actually going to be modeled after the last project we worked on. So if you recall, the project we worked on before was like some forms and tables that we were passing data from in regular JavaScript and HTML. We're going to build something pretty similar, but just using React versus regular JavaScript to talk about the differences, right? So if y'all are ready to rock with me on that front, you know what I'm saying, just give your boy a thumbs up, give me a like. If this is making sense to you so far, you're like, yo, this is making sense. Thanks, Cam, like just show me some love, you know what I'm saying? I just like to make sure y'all here and engage, and my rambling is making sense. Cool. Thank y'all so much. I appreciate the love. Can you explain what a component is again? I missed part of that. Yes, definitely. So components are essentially the building block of your application. We'll actually take a pretty deep dive into what they are in a second. But the idea is when we're building web applications, any web application, there are going to be different things you want to show on the application itself that don't necessarily relate to the elements often. Sometimes it just relates to whole sections. So let me just show you what I mean. So in this example of a component that we created, they created a component called profile, right? Profile is a pretty how do you define a profile? It depends on what application you're using, right? But in this application, it's saying, hey, a profile component is going to be consisting of a heading and an image, right? You could think of it like a micro section of HTML that you want to refer to as a particular object. So in this case, they're showing this is as a profile, right? Like somebody's name and a little profile icon, whatnot, right? But the React code that allows for us to do that is one, creating a component that we're going to create that will basically show the visual stuff we need it to show, which is in this case is the heading and the image. And that particular bit of code is called JSX. All of the lowercase kind of HTML looking stuff here is called JSX. And components you could think of as being like an object of JSX, like just kind of an object that you can use in your code and represent in your own way, whatever you want. So this is called a profile. It could be called anything or built into anything. But the idea is whenever I call a profile in my code, I'm going to be referring to these particular elements. So it allows us to kind of follow that like class object kind of structure of like, oh, well, I have a profile object that just has this data, right? And you can then use profile everywhere else in your code versus having to repeatedly define these same things. If you had like an app with 10 profiles or something, you could just use this one that you created. And that's what components are. Essentially, these assortments of different pieces of what we would call JSX, or these visual elements that we will then work with in JavaScript. Hopefully that makes sense, fam. It's a good question. Do I recommend the React course in Codecademy? Yeah, I would say so. I personally haven't done it. You know what I mean? I had to learn React from the streets. You know what I'm saying? And like, you know what I mean? Like most people, but the YouTube streets. But yeah, I would say the one in Codecademy is actually pretty good. There were times like maybe when I was teaching other folks before that I told them, hey, just do the one in Codecademy if you think it's fine. Another cool resource for learning React, if you want a free resource for like some more React stuff, is one, the react.dev website, which is, like I said, the main documentation for the React team and their code. The W3 Schools also has a free breakdown to React as well, tutorial and everything also. And they talk about all the big things you need to know: components, hooks, all of those things. So yeah, just some cool resources. And right here, you know what I'm saying? What better way to learn than just pulling up to these little sessions and hacking with your boy Cam, you know what I'm saying? Code with Cam. That's what it is. That's what we're trying to do. So with that being said, let's just jump into some of what we're going to do. And so to do this, we're going to end up building out some React applications ourselves. We're going to build one out today. But to do it, I need y'all to have the right systems on your machines. So first things first, if you don't have it yet, you're going to need to install Node on your machine. Node is essentially a runtime environment for JavaScript, which basically means it configures a space for the JavaScript to be run. It's like if you want to run the JavaScript outside of a browser, you have to use an environment built to run JavaScript like that. And Node is the largest platform built to do that. And so most JavaScript projects and libraries are going to use Node in some capacity, whether it's just to initialize the project and its files, or to create scripts that we can run within our JavaScript, install libraries and packages, execute libraries and packages and code. Like Node does a lot for us. So the first thing we got to do is download Node. So if you don't have it already on your machine, go to nodejs.org and download the one that's recommended for most users, mostly because this one is just the longest sustainable one, right? So that's kind of what the LTS, the long-term support one. This one, I forgot what the LTS is, but it's basically the one that has been supported, right? And is the stable version. And then the current run is like a lot more experimental. So it will have the same basis as the stable one, but this will also have some new things that they're working on. So for the sake of just your purposes, I would just download version 20. It's not going to make too big of a difference between this one or this one. So you can go ahead and grab this one. To confirm that you have Node on your machine, because I know some folks are probably wondering that, like, do I even have it? The easiest way is to just open up a terminal window of some kind, whether in your command prompt, the git bash, or just your Mac terminal or a terminal on your machine, and just type node dash dash version. And if you get back something other than an error that says node can't be found, like the command can't be found, then you have it installed on your machine. And if you don't have it installed on your machine, just go ahead and install it real quick. Should be pretty quick for you. If you have confirmed that you have Node on your machine, just do me a favor and raise your hand just so I can see how many folks have it. And you know, majority rules. We're gonna keep it pushing. You can definitely, if you have tried to install Node on your side and run into some troubles, feel free to let me know after these conversations. But if you have it and you're ready to go, just raise your hand real quick. It's just helpful for me to just kind of get a gauge of things. So if you are, I'm assuming some folks might be installing it. So I'll wait 3 minutes. Keep your hands up for me though, because it's just gonna be helpful. But we'll give it like 3 minutes for folks to just kind of get their systems ready. And really, that's all you really need to install right now, so long as you have VS Code, some type of text editor, and a browser to look at. So with those three things, I guess, Node, VS Code to write the code, and a browser to see it all, you should be good to go. So yeah, I'll give it like a minute or two to let folks get things going if they don't have Node installed, and to raise your hands when they got it done. So I'm seeing a lot of hands. Love that. I love that for us. All right, we need like yeah, I would just let it install whatever it's telling you it wants to install. Oh, they're installing a bunch of stuff. If they say it's optional, then you don't need it. I would just go with whatever the default settings are that they're telling you to install. But if they're saying, hey, we recommend it, go ahead and do it. All right, good people. We'll give it one more minute and we will rock. We will rock. All right, fam. Cool. So good majority, over the majority of folks got it. So that's good to see. Thank y'all so much for your patience, and let's just dive in here. So here is the vibe, right? When we are building out React applications, and I think it says this here somewhere in the React website, if you went to, I guess, installation and getting started, or how to start a React project, right? There are a couple different ways to create a React project in your dev experience, right? The most popular way, like the by far the most like common way that I see people use React is with what's called a framework to launch their project. Now, you can install all the libraries for React yourself and add them to an existing HTML page. It does have that capability, but most times when people are adding React to a site, they want React on the whole site. They don't want to have like a site that's built with just regular HTML and some JavaScript functions and then React on top of it. It's like, hey, we want React the whole way through. So typically folks will build the project from the ground up using React, right? And that's exactly what we're going to do. And to do that, we're going to use a React framework in order to scaffold our project, right? So the thing about React frameworks is that they are kind of community built command line tools that basically, like I said, scaffold a project for us. That means that they create the folder structure, it creates all of the necessary ingredients we need to run our code effectively. There are a lot of different React frameworks. Next is a pretty popular one, but it's a more very production grade one. I would say that it is. I don't want to. I ain't gonna badmouth Next. You know what I'm saying? We ain't gonna be haters out here. Next is a good framework. Trust me, I've used it before. It's a good framework. The thing is that Next is it can have like a steeper learning curve than some of the other frameworks for learning React. That's all I really wanted to say. It's like it's a great one to learn. If you learn it, there's a lot of production grade applications using it. And what ends up happening is sometimes people will start with one framework and then convert later to a more sophisticated one. I'd say Next is a pretty sophisticated one. So when you start with it, like I said, you can have kind of a little bit more of a learning curve than if you started with something different. Remix is one that is pretty popular now. Gatsby is one that you'll hear a lot about for just kind of more static websites that you want to still build with React. That's really cool. Expo is one of the React frameworks for when you're using mobile applications and building mobile applications and stuff like that. So they don't even show all of the ones that are here, but there is one that is fairly popular. I like it because it's pretty easy to download to use. Let me say, because you don't actually have to download anything, and it works really fast and makes your experience launching your projects like a breeze because it just kind of takes away the fat so that you don't have to wait forever for your projects to start. And that's a framework called Vite. So Vite is a framework, a JavaScript framework for scaffolding projects, but it's not specific. It's not only unique to React. Maybe that's why they didn't mention it on there in the website. You can use Vite to scaffold a number of different types of JavaScript projects. But in our case, we're going to use it actually to scaffold a React project. And if you were here last time we linked up, I kind of walked through it already. We can just run a pretty simple command that'll build out our project for us. So that's kind of what we're going to do. But I went through all the trouble of telling you all of these things just so you kind of get a sense of what is happening and why we're doing it, right? So if I had just jumped in and know this, and this, right, y'all would have been like, what the heck? But Vite is going to be the tool, the framework we're going to use to launch our project. Because we have Node installed, we have access to use some of the commands that allow for us to use something like Vite. And then to just show you that, right? We can use Vite supports a number of different types of JavaScript and TypeScript syntax. So when you're getting ready to start projects, either in just regular React or React with TypeScript, like this will help you scaffold your project in the best way. But you also could just do kind of some vanilla stuff, Vue, right? All these kinds of things, which is great. We're going to end up using it for React and JavaScript because we're not really focusing on TypeScript right now. But I just like it because it's a pretty quick framework. You don't have to install anything extra. Gives you pretty much everything you need out of the project to start. And keeps the speed of doing it pretty fast, which is one of the things I care a lot about. So as you can see, in order to get the Vite installation working, we need to use what's called npm. which is the Node Package Manager, which is one of the tools that when you install Node on your machine, you get access to the package manager, and it'll allow you to then run commands like this one in order to, yeah, just to create new applications or use like different Node packages to do certain things. So this is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to create a new project using Vite, and then from there, we're just going to go full steam ahead with React stuff. So first thing we got to do in order to do this is just run this command somewhere in our machine. Typically, you could just run this, pop this in the terminal and run it that way. But again, like I tell y'all all the time, I'm really a stickler when it comes to code file organization, mostly because you're going to end up pushing this to GitHub anyway at some point, right? So it's going to be helpful to make sure at least you keep your files organized in a way that makes sense to you, right? So I'm going to walk through the last time we linked up, I walked through kind of my personal workflow that I use to kind of create a project, which really involves me opening up a terminal, going to a folder that I have pre-created on my terminal for projects, right? And then popping in this command to create a new project right in there. If you're not as familiar with the terminal, don't worry. I definitely will try to sauce you up so that you can be as good as you can with the terminal. But for now, I'll just show you how you can do this same workflow with VS Code. It takes a couple little steps that hopefully aren't too awkward, but I'll explain why we do it the way we do it to make it make more sense for you. So first thing you're going to want to do, and as you're going ahead and following along with your boy, just let me know and I'll stop and pause so that folks can catch up. But you'll get this later so you can take a look at it yourself. First thing we want to do is open up a new VS Code window. And, you know, when VS Code first launches up, it's going to give you the option to find an old folder, open a new file, these types of things, right? So I used to tell folks all the time, hey, when you start a new project in VS Code, you should just open a new folder, right? And like kind of create a new folder with your code in there. That is great when you're like building, in my mind, when you're building like regular kind of like JavaScript or like regular code file projects. It's not so great when literally the command we're going to run is going to build a folder for us. So this workflow, if you do it just through VS Code, might feel a little awkward because there's a couple steps to it, but hopefully it still makes sense. So what I would encourage you to do is if you have a folder that, you know, you're already saving a bunch of projects in, great. If you don't, this is a good opportunity to create one. So no matter what your situation is, I would first click on open, right? And open is going to pull up a window for you to select a folder on your machine, right? Actually, yeah, open should open, yeah, to let you choose a folder on your machine. If you can see that on your side, give me a thumbs up. You won't be able to see it on mine because it doesn't share that on the screen share. But when you click open, it's going to give you the opportunity to select a folder. So if you have a folder that you're like, hey, I like saving projects here, right? It could be your desktop. It could be your documents folder. It could be a folder you created on your desktop that you like. It can be whatever folder you want. Choose whichever folder that is for you, right? So for me, for the sake of this example, I'm going to use my desktop. So let's say I'm cool with just saving my code on or my projects on my desktop folder. I'm going to open my desktop folder on VS Code, which, you know, right now my desktop doesn't actually have a lot of crazy files, so it's actually fine. But you want to be careful about this because if you choose a folder that has a lot of stuff, you're going to end up seeing all those files on the left-hand side here, right? But the real reason we're doing this is so that we can use VS Code to just use the terminal and quickly add our new project to that same folder. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to open up whatever folder we love. So for me, I'm just using my desktop because it's a simple enough example that hopefully you'll get. Typically, I wouldn't do it with my desktop. I'll have a separate folder inside of my desktop or a folder on my root home directory that I like to save code to. Anyway, once you open that folder, that's kind of like your big folder, right? All you're going to want to do is open up a terminal, right? And when you open up the terminal in VS Code, the reason why we got to do all of this is when you open the terminal in VS Code, it'll open specifically in the path of whatever folder you opened. So in this case, I said, oh, I want to do this on my desktop. I'm already in my desktop in the terminal, right? So if you're the type of person that's not really savvy with navigating through the terminal and stuff like this, that's why I'm showing you this way, so you can still kind of get the same benefits without having to go learn a bunch of terminal-based commands, even though I'm going to really try to stress that we do it through the terminal because this is easier. Anyway, we're on the desktop now. So this is, like I said, this is a place where I like to save my projects. So I'm going to actually run this command. So the command is this: npm create vite at latest. And this command, when you press enter, is going to start a command line interface for us to create a new project. If you're following along with me, just give me a thumbs up so I know how many folks are. Some folks might not be, which is cool, but just wanna gauge, you know what I'm saying? Just wanna gauge the folks that are like, yeah, I'm doing it with you, fam. You know what I'm saying? We out here, ride or die. Yeah. All right, cool. So then y'all will see that we have this pop up in the terminal for us to add some information. So we have this first part says project name. So this is what you're gonna name your project. Whatever you name this project is also going to be the name of the folder that it creates. So I'm going to call this project, let's just call it, well, this one is called Favelinks is the name of the app that I'm going to build with y'all. So I'm just going to call it Favelinks like this, and I'll press enter to go to the next prompt. It's going to say, okay, what framework do you want to use? So use the arrow keys, return and submit. So I can use the arrow keys to get down to React, press enter. And then it says, okay, we got React selected. Now choose a variant, which really means there's different ways you can launch a React project. Which one do you want to use? So the one I'm going to go ahead and use is just JavaScript, regular JavaScript, because it'll just create the more standard kind of React application that I need with JavaScript. So I'll go to JavaScript, press enter, and now you can see it says scaffolding a project in users Camino, which is my username, desktop, Favelinks, right? Then it says, okay, now run cd favelinks, npm install, npm run dev. These three commands are the commands that will, this is what these three commands are doing. This command is going to move you from whatever folder you were in where you ran this create command to then the folder that it created for you. So it now created a folder. You can see on the left-hand side, there's now a folder here called Favelinks for my project. Then it says run npm install and npm run dev. These two commands have to be run inside of the folder that it just created. Otherwise, it won't work, right? So I want to be inside of this folder in order to run these other two commands. So here's where workflow-wise, you're going to want to just kind of switch things up here at this point. We made the project. It's inside of our desktop or whatever folder you really like. Now, if I were you, I would go to File, Open Folder again. This is where I said it gets a little awkward, right? Open Folder again, and find that new folder it just created. So in my case, it's Desktop Favelinks. So I'm just going to go ahead and just open that, which is going to relaunch VS Code and just get me right in the middle of this particular folder, which again, saves me some trouble in the terminal, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, now when I open the VS Code terminal, I'm exactly where I need to be to run the commands I need to get my project running. The two commands I need to run, npm install and npm run dev. So in this terminal, which is now inside of my Favelinks folder that I just created, I can run npm install, which is going to go ahead and install some particular the libraries and packages that I need for making React work. And then once that's done, I'm able to run npm run dev, which is a Vite specific command that will help us launch our project. And we'll take a look at what that does in a second and what that means for us when we go ahead and when this install finishes. So hopefully y'all see why I kind of did it this way for the folks who aren't really familiar with terminal-based navigation and stuff like that. Like I said, all of my other sessions and videos are probably going to show you how to just do it through the terminal. But I figured for folks who are still a little confused about using the terminal, hopefully this workflow will make your life a little bit easier as you're ramping up with your terminal foo. Now that the npm install is done, you can see it said it added 276 packages, audited 277, right? No vulnerabilities. Great, cool. What this means is npm is a command that goes ahead and installs packages to our project. A package is essentially a bundle of JavaScript that you can pull into your project. And so we use JavaScript packages for all types of stuff. Some of our default JavaScript tools require packages, especially when you get into things like using React, which, like we talked about, needs the React library, the React DOM library, and those are packages. Those get installed into our program via the npm install command. The npm install command is a part of Node. Remember, Node is what powers all of the stuff we're looking at right here. And it is npm just basically pulls and installs certain packages defined in what we call a package.json file. The package.json file, and we'll get into package.json and these particular files a lot more in our next few weeks. This is the default configuration file for JavaScript projects, package.json. This is the file that if you looked at this file in any JavaScript, if you see this project, if you see a file like this in any project, chances are that project is using JavaScript and Node, right? Node will use the package.json for very specific things, like creating some scripts that you can call from the terminal to run specific commands, or determining different packages and libraries that you're going to use inside of your code. And those packages and libraries, like the React DOM, or all of these ones that are here called dev dependencies, they are called dependencies because our program is dependent on those packages. These are like kind of basically saying, hey, I want this package at that version number, or this package at that version number. And it's not until we do npm install that we actually get those packages into our program and into our application by way of the Node modules folder. So remember, we're using Node. Node and npm is the package manager. The package manager pulls these bundles of JavaScript code that we call modules into our application so that we can reference them and use them however we want. Those modules are stored in a folder called Node modules. And the list of all of the modules that you've installed on your machine, like that your project installed specifically, are always going to be hosted in the package.json file. So in the future, when we add new packages to our React applications, you're going to see that we call the command to add the package in the terminal, but it adds to this list of dependencies, whatever ones we add, which is really, really helpful to keep track of which things have we installed or added to our project. So with that, we've talked about two of the main important files here. And we'll talk about the rest right after we run the second command that the Vite application install told us to do. So the first one it said was, hey, run npm install. That way we can add all the packages. The next one it said to do was run npm run dev, right? So npm, again, the Node package manager. So we can use this to run commands like install and stuff that are built into npm to help us with packages. Or we can use npm to run particular scripts that are defined in our package.json. So in this case, we're saying, hey, npm, run whatever script I've defined in the package.json called dev. And that particular script is pre-installed for us when we use the Vite scaffold to call the Vite command. So the Vite command will do what it needs to do to finally go ahead and launch our project. The way Vite does this is it creates this little configuration file that has particular information that it knows it will use in order to launch our project the best way. So this is just a file created by Vite so that when we run that Vite commands, it knows, hey, here's how we're launching this particular project. It's a React project. We don't have to write any of this. All of this code was pre-written for us when we used the Vite command in the first place. So now all I got to do is do this npm run dev in the same terminal window of the folder. And as you can see, it's going to launch a local server for me to use. It says, hey, you have a Vite server running at localhost 5173. So this particular link, I can follow the link with a control click or a command click, or you can just copy it. But this link will go ahead and take us to a running local server for our React code. And one of the cool things about React is the fact that they already have a live server built into a lot of these frameworks. So instead of having to go to VS Code and use the live server we might have installed there, we can just leverage the live server built into a lot of these particular frameworks. And so if you can see this screen on your side, just give me a thumbs up, you know what I mean? Just to keep track of the folks following along with your boy. But this is where you get started when you finally launch a particular React-based application, right? Regardless of the framework you choose, there's some things about each framework that's a little different. But what is common about every framework is the case that you use the terminal to set up the project folder, then you kind of open that project folder in VS Code or somewhere to actually write and make your changes. And they most often have a live server built into them. Sometimes the port number is different based on whichever framework it is that you're using. But yeah, the setup is about the same. So cool. I see some folks in the chat were having some errors. I'll definitely make myself available so we can chat through it. The Vite command is not found is an interesting error to have, because if you ran the steps the same way we just did, where we just kind of we did like npm run dev or something like this, if your local machine didn't know about Vite, it would have asked to install it. So we'll take a look at that maybe after we link here. So, all right, boom. Let's say everything works, which it should work pretty smoothly. You get your app up. I saw a bunch of folks with their thumbs up, which is really helpful. Thank you so much. We're gonna have this kind of pre-built project to work off of. As you can see, the live server is kind of launching a pre-built project for us with some information here. That information is great. Like, it just kind of confirms that, hey, everything's set up, you're good to go. It says edit source app.jsx to save and test what we call hot reloading. So basically it says source / app.jsx. So if I go back to VS Code, I can see there is a folder called source. If I open that and I look, there is also a file called app.jsx, right? And the app.jsx file has a lot of different code in it. We actually kind of walked through this a little bit last time, but all of this, remember, is JSX. It's the JavaScript elements that we create to basically, in JavaScript, define the visual things I want to see. So in this, you can see, hey, we're going to use a div, and the div is going to hold a couple things. It's going to hold an anchor with an image, another anchor with an image, right? One to the Vite logo, one to the, looks like the React logo. You know, we have a heading that says Vite and React. We have a div with the class name card here that has a button, a paragraph, and then looks like there's another paragraph underneath, right? And if we go back, sure enough, that's exactly what it looks like it's happening here. We got the logos with the little anchors that allow us to click and do stuff with them. We got that heading. Here's a button, a paragraph real close to that button, and another paragraph underneath, right? So hopefully y'all get the sense that, hey, this is similar to what we're actually seeing here. And if you don't fully believe me, right, we can go ahead and open the inspector in the console, and we'll be able to see very directly that all of these elements are corresponding to the same elements that we are seeing inside of this app.jsx file. The difference is, here's the HTML document we're working off of, right? Remember, with any web page, we can open up the browser and look at HTML elements through the inspector. Well, the body is here. When I open the body, there's two lines in there. One for this div ID equals root, and that looks like it's highlighting everything that we're seeing currently. And then there's this script that looks like it's bringing in a module for and linking to a particular file that we have in our project called main.jsx. Now, the div with the ID root is HTML, clearly, we can see it here. And when I open that up, you can see, here's the div. That div has two anchors, right? With the logos for the different stuff and some text in there. We have the H1 heading for the Vite and React. We have this div that inside of there for this card, we have a button, right? And a paragraph, right? All of these elements, HTML-wise, track exactly with these JSX elements that we have in this JavaScript file, right? That is one of the things that is so dope about React, right? There's a one-to-one kind of correlation between the JSX you write and the HTML that gets rendered finally on the HTML. How this happens is through a particular set of functions that is that are defined within that main.jsx file that our HTML calls as a script. That file is using some React library some of the React library information in order to basically first target our div with the ID root, and then create what's called a root from a React DOM perspective, which basically, long and short of this, is the React and React DOM libraries have some functionality in it that allow for us to essentially very simply refer to the JavaScript we need to render our JSX to any element inside of an existing HTML file. So React kind of inserts JavaScript into existing HTML. We have that existing HTML file here. It's very simple. There's nothing in there in the body except that div. But we target that div, and we're using that script that is referring to this main.jsx file. We're able to use the React DOM and React libraries in order to essentially render a component, our first component, to the screen. So when we're working with React, it's going to come to the case that we're working with components a lot. And realistically, the component that we're most fascinated with is going to be, most times by default, a lot of these first components that get created is called the app component. But we can render anything, right? So let's say I'm like, hey, this is all cool and all, but what I mean? Like, I just want to show some, instead of maybe all of this stuff that might confuse y'all for right now, let's say I just wanted to show a very simple H1 that said, hey, this is gonna render, right? And then I gotta get rid of this extra, do I need to get rid of this? Yeah, I think, no, I don't. So, hey, this is gonna render, right? So we can render really anything. In this file, this is a .jsx file, right? And the thing is that a .jsx file is essentially a .jsx file is the same thing almost as a regular JavaScript file, except it knows that you're gonna also use React elements inside of it. So you're gonna use some JSX inside of it. There's some conversation about whether regular JavaScript files or .jsx files are slightly smaller and more optimized. I think because Vite prioritizes speed, they're using a lot of .jsx files versus regular JavaScript files. But in some frameworks, these will all just be regular JavaScript files. There's not really a big difference in that sense, outside of some small performance things. I say that to say that this is just a regular JavaScript file. We're writing JavaScript in here, right? So this line right here isn't HTML. This is actually JSX, right? This is a super simple line of JSX that's gonna help us, like I said, convert some JavaScript from JavaScript, something that I want to show up visually, into what needs to be rendered finally on my HTML document inside of this element, right? This is why we took the long way to get here, because it really requires you to understand at least, hey, here we're looking at something on our HTML document. here we're calling just some interesting React code in a function called render and passing what looks to be like some visual elements. And essentially, the render function is taking care of pushing that particular bit of code onto our document here, which is exactly what's happening. React creates a root node within our document. And when we render code into that root node, it essentially changes the HTML with whatever the JSX is that we told it to show. So in this case, this is a simple H1, but in the old case, what they had as a default was a pretty sophisticated look. It looks more sophisticated than it actually is, but they just created a component that is going to basically, like I was mentioning before, reference a component that's going to reference essentially the JSX that it wants us to show, right? So remember in the app.jsx, we have all of the actual visual stuff we want to see. The way that React works, we typically like to use it to essentially keep different pieces of code isolated from other pieces of code to make our code a little bit more robust. And we're going to work on that ourselves today. But just to show you what came back as a default, they had all of this code here as like just an example of some, pretty substantial JSX. And in order to keep things kind of clean in each file, they wrote that in its own file. So app.jsx is its own file with its own bit of code. That code has a function called app and a couple imports that, two are for the logos that it's going to use. One is for connecting this file to some CSS. And then the third is to do some stuff with what we call state in React, which we'll get into a little later. The point I'm trying to make here is remember what I told you about components. Components are essentially just JavaScript functions that define and return some JSX that's eventually going to be shown on our application or rendered somewhere. So in this case, this function is called app. Remember, we called this a component. We know this is a component because of this capitalized letter here. And a component is essentially, you could think of like a custom JSX element. So JSX elements are typically mapped to the actual HTML element that they refer to, right? So like a JSX div is mapped to the HTML div, the anchor is mapped to the HTML anchor. But let's say you want to have your own custom little element. Well, you need to create a component that will be what basically determines what that custom element is going to be. In this case, they're just returning some JSX that defines what the app component is. And then they're exporting it so that we can then import it in another file, which is what this line is here, to import this particular app component. And then they call in the app component here. This React strict mode thing is just kind of like a default thing, a tool that they add to React projects to make it so that they give you extra highlights on like potential problems and errors that pull up. It doesn't really impact anything visually. You could theoretically get rid of it. It just kind of helps you a little bit with error handling and error checking in the console. But even if I just kind of had the app component like this, everything will still render as you would have expected it to, which is to say, the app is the visual component that we're showing. That app is comprised of all of this little other HTML like elements here. And that is what eventually is getting rendered in our actual HTML here inside of all of the inside of the actual div with the ID root that we're talking about here. So I've been talking on and on and on, but if this is making sense to you, just give me a thumbs up. Again, I'm trying to just make sure as I go through diving into stuff, I do it in a way where hopefully it also gives you some context and a better understanding of what you're looking at. Thank y'all so much. I appreciate seeing that. Cool. Awesome. So that's enough about like this kind of default application that we didn't even create, right? Let's go and talk about building an application. And as I work on building it, I want y'all to just kind of follow along and you'll see and we'll talk through a lot of the really important aspects of how we use React in order to structure these projects out. So first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go back to the Vite application that we launched, right? Inside of our VS Code, right? And the first thing I'm gonna do here, I'm actually gonna just delete everything that's inside of this app.jsx right now. Oops, yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and delete everything in there. And even this export line, we'll add it back later, right? So basically, with the app.jsx, here's why the app.jsx is important in any capacity in this particular project. Here's why it's important. It's important because the main point of entry file for this Vite application is this main.jsx. And here in the main.jsx, we're saying that we're going to render whatever's in the app component, right? The app from app.jsx. So if I'm importing this component from this file and that's what I'm rendering, this file is going to become important. Do we need a component called app.jsx to have our code work or anything? Not really. It just is like kind of like the default component that a lot of times is chosen to be the component that starts, that is the first component rendered. Then how it works in React is anything that the app says that it needs to show will show up because we're rendering the app. So we can also define components inside of our app that we might want to see show up in any capacity inside of our work. So that's what we're going to do to start. First thing I want to do is I want to create a little application that is going to help us learn a little bit of the core concepts of React. We might get through a piece of it today and do a little bit of it later. I might be like, hey, y'all do it yourselves. You know what I'm saying? We'll see. But we're going to essentially build an application very similar to the little HTML application we built the other day, where we were basically taking in inputs from a form, passing it to a table, and showing the results on our web page. So if y'all recall, to do that, we needed three things. We needed a form, we needed a table, and we needed like something to push data from the form to the table, right? Those were kind of the three things that we needed to have in order to build the little HTML application that we had. In order to push the data from the form to the table, I'm going to be more specific. It wasn't just something, it was some JavaScript. It was like some JS to push data from the form to the table. So these are the things that we needed. How can we go about doing this in the context of what we're learning about today with relationship to React, right? So let's say I want to create a form. And right now it looks like, I haven't saved this, so they're still showing something. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new app component just so that I have a component to render on the screen. Because if I save this without anything in here, and it tries to pull and render an application that doesn't exist, we're going to actually see when it reloads that there's going to be some problems with relationship to what it's seeing. I don't know why it's taking so long to reload. This is an issue here. But as you can see, there's nothing here, right? There's not going to be able to render anything because there's nothing there. So I want to actually be able to render our app. And to do that, I'm going to need to make sure that I give it a component to render. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new component. So before we get into like some of this, I'm going to just mark this as a to-do. Before we get into this, the first thing I want to do is create an app component to render as our main component, right? So to do that, I'm going to create a new component. I'm going to call it app. And that component, remember, is just going to be a function. And so I'm going to just call function app. And remember, I keep the capitalized letter for the sake of making sure that capitalized component names, right? So I have this function component here. And what I want to be able to do is any component, all components, all components have to return some JSX. Like that's literally it. That's like the main job of any component is to return some JSX. So I'm gonna just write a quick return statement and put some JSX in here to start. Say placeholder for the app, right? And now I have some code here. I have some JSX. It's returning from the function. But when I go here, I still don't see anything. Well, why is that? Well, I have this is a pretty valid component, right? But right now, the main.jsx is expecting me to export it so that it can import it and show it here. And I'm not exporting it as of right now. So what I want to do is either at the bottom or, sometimes people do it in line, but I'll just do it down here. I'm going to say export default app, which is basically a command to say, hey, we're going to create a new export. It's going to be the default export of this file, meaning like if somebody just says, hey, I want to import whatever's in app.jsx, the thing that they'll get as a default is this object, which is our app function. So by putting this back in here, we're going to, we should see this refresh with our code, placeholder for the app, boom. So voila, we have at least our first little dig coming back as a component. This is an even simpler example of a React component than maybe the default one that they give us in the starting place. But you can see, hey, this is translated into some H1 HTML. All the stuff we were talking about before is still happening. We now have the capacity to keep building. So let's keep building. As I go, I want to just point out some stuff just so that it kind of, if you're like, hey, this is kind of cool. Like what else can I do with just this function app? Well, one other thing that happens by default when you first start the Vite app is it creates this app.css file for you, right? And the app.css file, again, they already created this. So it has a lot of different little pieces of CSS already inside of it. But one of the things that if you want to connect your a component to some CSS, typically what you'll see is people create a CSS file that is given the same name as the component. It doesn't have to have the same name as that component, but it just kind of you see that as a practice. I can import into any component some styles by just saying, hey, import, and then giving it the path to the particular CSS file that I wanted to take a look at. So in this case, I added that line back, and because the app.css has some styles in here where it's looking for that div with the ID root, remember, hashtag will give us the ID root, and it looks like it does a text-align center, which is nice. It just kind of made this look a little nicer. But that's how you can connect to some styles. It's just literally import the CSS file you want into whatever functional component you want. And so long as you target the right elements, you can target IDs in your HTML. This is just targeting the root element. But typically with React, you're going to target class names. And class names, you can pass to any element just as with like a little attribute. You know what I'm saying? Test class, right? So if I wanted to style this, I could style this by in the CSS, adding some CSS for something like test class, color blue, right? And that would style how I wanted to style. Point is, that's not really, this is just a little bit of what we're talking about here. So I just made my first component. It's just an app. It's just the app component. Very simple to just get the ball rolling to show what we got going on. But I want to actually build out this application so that there's a couple pieces to it, right? The first piece is I want to have a form that a user can fill out, and then I want to have a table that the user can see some data in, right? So let's just go ahead and add those two pieces and just talk about that process. So that we can use it as an opportunity to talk more about components in JSX. So right now I have one component, right? That component is called app. It's the app component. It's the default component that I'm rendering in this file. And all I'm doing right now is returning an H1 with this text inside of it. That app component is what the main class, our main file is rendering finally to the HTML. So let's say I want to add some more visual things to this. Clearly, I could do something like, oh, well, underneath this H1, maybe instead of placeholder for the app, I'm going to say um, submit your fave links, right? And then underneath this, I might say, oh, well, hey, I want to actually give somebody a form, right? Remember in HTML, there's an element called form, right? And in that form, there's an element called input, right? And that input has some properties like type that allow us to say things like, hey, this is going to be a text input for, this is going to be a text input, right? And I'm going to use that text input to show the user a place to input some data. Right now, you can see like there's this, I'm getting this really interesting syntax error in VS Code. I'm so sorry, y'all. Fast. My brain is like trying to keep up, but I'm on fasting time. I'm getting this little error warning thing here. The reason why is because in React, syntactically, you can't just have two floating elements. All elements that are gonna like where there's multiple elements that you're returning have to have a wrapping container on them. So this error where it's saying something like, hey, JSX expressions must have at one parent element means that the form right now and the H1 right now are two separate elements, but there's no, it needs us to return one particular element holding those things. So there's a couple ways we can fix this. One easy way is to just add a div, right? And then move all of this code into the div, right? The div will act as a parent container for us, right? Remember, that's what divs are for. So if I save this, I don't get that warning, and I actually come back and I see my input, right? So everything is in here. So that's cool. If I take a look at the actual HTML, now we can see, just to prove the point, right? I'm not going to keep doing this, but now we have that form and that input is in there. And hey, even that H1 is here with the class test class. Even though we called originally for this with class name, React is so smart that even when it rendered the H1, it rendered it with a class instead of class name. So it's all real cool in how it works out to turn it from JavaScript right into the HTML. I might want, instead of just this input with type text, right? I might want to put like a nice little label in here and just say, hey, this is the label for, we give it this input to say, let's just say link name. And then this input, we can give it a name of link name, right? And why is this mad at me? Oh, because I didn't close the label. And so now, right, we can say something like, all right, cool. So we have the, oh my God, nobody was going to tell me that I got like massively, got like crazy dark. That's crazy. I'm over here like just sitting in code darkness. That's wild. That's wild that y'all just literally did that to me. That's insane. I look like a serial killer coder. Why would y'all do that to me? That's wild. I didn't see my face this entire time. That's so funny. I'm crying. Anyway, we have the label and we have this input, right? And so the label gives me an opportunity to say, hey, this is gonna just say link name, right? And then when I go ahead and come back, okay, cool, I have this nice little label, great. And then if I want to keep going, I could say boom, right? Maybe I want to have another label, right? For link URL. It's going to be link URL and an input type equals text, and the name is going to be link URL, just like so. And boom. So now I should have kind of two little inputs, doing what they gotta do. If I wanted to style this really lazily, I'll just add a break line here to kind of give them a little bit of space. But cool. At least I have something here for putting some of the form data in there, right? Now I might be like, oh, well, I want to have a table and all that extra stuff, right? I could also put a table in here, right? I could put whatever elements HTML wise that I'm used to working with inside of this particular bit of code. And so to start this, I will just say, hey, like let's say, hey, we want to have a table. Tables have a lot of different elements inside of them, but one element that at least will help us just see something to start is a table row with a table head that is kind of just going to define some stuff. So let's just say link. Let's just say link name and table head link URL, right? And so hopefully putting this in here. Yeah, okay, we get a nice little table. It's hard to see because there's no actual data in there, but we see something, right? And that's proof enough that there's something there, right? Um, so cool, right? So I'm showing you this to show you that, hey, within the React space, we can just continue to add what we were doing with HTML into these particular components that we're starting, right? So in this app component, I'm now doing the heading. I have this form in there. I have this table in there, etc. Now, where does this concept of components come from and why is it helpful, right? Hopefully you can see how if I keep programming like this file is just going to become massive with a lot of different elements in there. And it's going to look just as kind of convoluted as a regular HTML file looks, right? Give me a thumbs up if y'all get what I'm saying. And you can see me clearly now because the light is on. Jeez. Right? Like it's gonna be kind of difficult, right? It's gonna be kind of difficult because of the fact that, hey, we're not gonna be able to read this over time because there's gonna be a lot going on. One of the beautiful values of using JavaScript is the fact that we don't have to have everything in one place. We can pull stuff from one file from another file and just keep our files easier to read and work with, right? Separation of concerns and stuff like that. So the thing is that the same applies to components, right? Instead of having all of these things live in the same component, I can break them up into their own components. And the reason why that will be helpful is, let's say I'm going to have I'm going to show this table on a different page, right? I don't want to just have this hard coded here. I would want that same table to show up the same way in a different file or folder or page, excuse me, right? To do that, I can make these things components, which will allow me to call them over and over again in different capacities. So I might say, instead of just having these as within the same component, this app component, I could create a function for the form and say, hey, this is going to be my form component, right? And in here, I could say, oh, well, take everything I was going to do for this form and just return this as a component, right? And now with this form component that I created here, right? I can say, hey, in the app, I don't only have to render JSX. I can also render components, other components. So I can say, hey, I want to render the form, right? And so remember, the component has a capital letter, whereas all the regular JSX is always lowercase. So that's how and it even has a different color to let us know, hey, this is going to be this is a different type of element than these actual JSX elements. But when we go back, everything still looks the same, right? The cool thing is, well, now that the form is just a component that the app is rendering, I can add more stuff to this and say, hey, now I want to give it, give it some more space for a little bit, and then create an input type submit, and then let that be, whoops, this is an input, now it's an input, right? To get a nice little submit button, right? And just by the logic that's already here, it's submitting like it would have done in HTML, right? And if we finish that last project like y'all finished, I know y'all know what we have to do to make some of this stuff work. And we're going to be diving into what we got to do that from a React standpoint. That's actually going to be some of what y'all are going to work on. But the idea here is this, right? We can create these custom components to refer to anything that we want to show that was just previously just JSX, right? So same could be said about this table. Instead of having a table defined within the app, I can also just create a new component that is going to be responsible for returning my table, right? So I'm going to say, hey, this my custom table component, right? And all this has to do is, render return some JSX, right? That's all these components have to do. And so in here, I'm just going to take this table and put that here, right? And I'm returning some JSX, and I have this new component called table that I can use. Well, down here, I can say, all right, cool. Add the table, right? Everything's still pretty much the same within the app. Nothing really changes from the front end perspective, but look at just how much cleaner this application functional component is, right? Without knowing all of the details of what's in the form and what's in the table component, you can read it, right? Give me a thumbs up if you could you look at this and you can read it. You're like, this is an app. It has an H1, a form, and a table, right? Like, it's pretty straightforward. And that's what's really awesome about the ways that components work in our app, and why I keep calling them building blocks, right? Because you can make any component, any of whatever you want it to be, and so long as it's returning some JSX and you're rendering it somewhere in another component, you're going to be good at being able to show that component in your actual application. Remember, the app component ends up being exported, so that allows us to call it in this other file. Because the table and the form aren't being exported from this particular file, we wouldn't be able to come in here and then say something like import table, right? Because it doesn't exist, right? It's not exported into here. We could export it into here, but rather than do that, I'll show you what we typically would do is create a new folder for all of our components. So I'm going to have a folder for my components just to keep my app even cleaner. So instead of having all these like floating components inside of the app, I can also make them their own files. So I can say, hey, table.jsx, and the table.jsx, the table.jsx, all it needs to do is just like the app was doing, is take that component and export default table, right? That way, now I can call the table component from a different file, like maybe my app.jsx. And instead of just importing some CSS, I can also import table from /components/table, right? So this is going to get me this table that I created in this folder called components. This is the path to that particular file. So now, even though this is a component in a different file, I can still refer to it here as table because I'm importing it here at the top, right? So when I save this, we still see what we got to see because everything is gravy, right? Same could be done for the form. So I'm actually going to do that as well. I'm going to just create a new component called form.jsx. And oops, I created a new folder instead of a file. Move to trash. So inside of this components, I'm going to create a new file called form.jsx. And I'm going to paste the form and export default form, right? That way, when I go to my app, I can also import, oops, if I could spell it, form from /components/form, right? And now the form and the table still refer to the JSX that I need to show up, but they live in their own files, have their own kind of responsibilities, and everything is really clean, right? The app file is really easy and clean to read because everything is just straightforward. The form, if I wanted to learn more about the form, I could just go to this file and learn more. Oh, this is just a form component that's returning a form with a couple inputs. Great. If I go back to the app, oh, this is a table component. And this table component is just returning a HTML, returning a JSX table, excuse me, that ends up becoming rendered as HTML. And that's the default. That's really all you need to know about creating components is that we can create components. We can create one super long component with just as much JSX as we want, or we can separate those components into smaller components. And then those components could be made inside of the same file, or you can import them from other files that you might create inside of your project as well. So with that being said, right, now we kind of have a dope scaffold for our own little project. We have everything we need. We have some inputs, a submit button, and the table. So now we just need to learn what does it take for us to actually pass the data from like an input, like a form like this over to our table. And that's exactly what we're going to look at in the next time that we sync up because it looks like we're out of time for today. Boo, boo, hoo, woo, woo. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna continue into this journey, and he's like, "Boo!" We're gonna continue into this journey. You know what I'm saying? But by talking more about, well, how are we gonna pass data from this particular set of components to a different component, which is a really important topic when it comes to using React, and it'll talk about it'll help us learn about some more really important tools in React as we get going. But thank y'all for your time. We're gonna continue this in a couple days, so stay tuned, and yeah, stick around if you have some questions. Otherwise, I will see y'all later. Thanks. Thank y'all. Appreciate it.